Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. In this week's episode, I'm going to talk about toxic masculinity. I'm going to start with a definition, and then we're going to get into toxic masculinity and the idea of a constructed identity and how that is created within culture, within society. Then I want to explore defenses and the way in which we try and protect our identity regardless of the reasons. And then I want to ask, what is being protected? And I'm going to suggest that really what we're trying to do is protect the sense of vulnerability. And the question I will ask at this point is, why can't vulnerability be expressed? So the idea here being, we are experiencing vulnerability, we're creating some kind of defense. What is it that tells us that we can't express this vulnerability? There'll be an example that I give about the way in which gender and masculinity can be encoded into our environment. And once it's encoded into our environment, we tend to think we're coming up with these ideas. However, we're really just drawing upon these implicit lessons and explicit lessons that are happening in our growth and development and through culture and so on. And then I'll finally ask, what does being a quote-unquote man even really mean? And that'll allied nicely into future conversations about gender and the way in which gender can be understood beyond the binary constructs that may be used by some that really have more to do with the language that is imposed than the actual experience that is existent. So I want to start with the definition of what toxic masculinity is. But first, why is this even a topic that I wanted to approach? Well, I've been having discussions with different people about various different things. And one of the topics that just happened to come up, it wasn't on... I'm not even sure how it came up, to be honest, but it came up in this idea of toxic masculinity and people throwing this term around. And what happened in this discussion is I started to get a sense that all of us talking about this had an idea of what toxic masculinity was without explicitly expressing or defining what toxic masculinity was. So what this meant was there was a lot of room for misinterpretation, there was a lack of clarity, and there was certainly a lot of frustration, a lot of emotion that was being expressed as we, used this term. And I had this real sense that what are we talking about? I'm hearing how people are using the term, and I'm hearing it not only in conversations I've had, but in things that are posted or things that are discussed. And it's not entirely clear what this term means. So in this discussion with a group of guys, I said, well, why don't we just ask ChatGPT? And so this is what ChatGPT, spit out. I asked, what is toxic masculinity? And ChatGPT replied, toxic masculinity refers to a set of socially constructed attitudes and behaviors associated with traditional masculinity that are harmful and restrictive, both to men themselves and to society as a whole. It is important to note that toxic masculinity does not imply that all masculinity is inherently toxic or that all men exhibit toxic behaviors. Instead, it focuses on specific harmful traits and expectations that can be reinforced by societal norms. Toxic masculinity perpetuates the idea that men must conform to rigid gender roles, which include traits such as dominance, aggression, emotional suppression, and the need to assert power and control over others. These expectations can lead to negative consequences for both men and women. For example, toxic masculinity can contribute to the normalization of violence as a way to solve problems, resulting in higher rates of aggression and conflict. It may discourage men from seeking help for mental health issues or emotional support, as they are often discouraged from expressing vulnerability or seeking assistance, leading to negative impacts on their well-being. Additionally, toxic masculinity can reinforce sexist attitudes and gender inequality by devaluing traditional feminine qualities and behaviors. It is important to address toxic masculinity and promote healthier forms of masculinity that allow individuals to express a full range of emotions, engage in respectful and egalitarian relationships, and challenge harmful gender stereotypes. This helps create a more inclusive and equitable society for everyone. Once I shared this ChatGPT definition, immediately the tone of the conversation changed. All of a sudden, this idea that toxic masculinity wasn't something that one person accuses somebody else of, but rather it is something that limits us as men. And this is where we get into the question of constructed identity and social in society and in culture. That if we're operating within an implicit understanding of what gender is, of what it is to be a man, and we are feeling rejected, we are feeling vulnerable, and we'll explore vulnerability in a moment, but we're feeling vulnerable, and then we move to trying to protect ourselves. And the option is aggression. This is kind of the key part of toxic masculinity, because why is it when we're feeling vulnerable, when we're feeling exposed, we can't say, I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm feeling exposed? If all we have is the proverbial hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And if being a man is about the proverbial hammer, then we cannot express aspects of our experience. The question is, do we, and does anybody as a man experience vulnerabilities? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. Of course, there's an experience of vulnerability that happens. Well, what's in our toolkit? What's available to us as an option? Can we break down and cry? Can we ask for help? Can we seek counsel and support? Can we talk to other men? Not in an aggressive way, espousing more rigidity, but in a more open-ended, hopeful way, being curious about different people's experiences. Are these options we have? If we do not have these as options, then the reason it becomes toxic is because the environment is confining. It's poisonous because we are not able to expand beyond the register of this domain. And so we're not given, and we do not have any other means of expressing ourselves beyond the hammer, the proverbial hammer. And that toxicity means we are replying and responding to each and every experience in some form of aggression. It can be aggression towards other, it can be aggression towards ourselves, and of course it can be both. So if we think about the way in which this is constructed in society and culture, it's not provocative of me to say that being a man and what that means starts to be played out in ways that operate in a very underhanded and seemingly transparent way. So, an example I saw was it was some kind of video where there was a man with 3 young kids, and they were, my guess is, say 5-ish. And one boy, one girl, and I forget who the third person was. But what I do remember is this boy, who was maybe 4 or 5, was giving this man advice. He was saying, how would I meet somebody? How would I date? I'm not exactly clear why this is what they were doing, but it was some kind of comedy game thing. And the boy jumped in and said, you have to be a man. You have to be assertive. You have to just tell her what you want. So this boy picked this up, not necessarily from their parents, but picked it up from their environment. And this is the kind of key here, is this is being picked up in an implicit way as to what's available to that boy. So if you think about yourself as a man, as a male listener, and you think, well, what options do I have in talking to different people about my feelings? Are all my friends people I can share fears and anxieties, stress and uncertainty with? Can I do it without joking? Can I do it without circumventing the point, mocking or otherwise being effuse? Or can I actually speak directly about these experiences? Similarly, as a man talking to a woman, what can I say to a woman? Can I talk to her about aggression or things that I'm frustrated a bit about? What is available to me at any given point? And this starts to get into the question of our identity. How do we know ourselves, and how do we exist within this frame of what we call ourself? And what I think is interesting about this is we have a relationship with ourself that we think is absolute, yet we die. And presumably we're aware enough to realize we're going to die, even if we're engaged in some form of denial about when it'll happen or what it actually means. There is some type of understanding that this self will end. Now, some may have beliefs that allow them to transcend death through an ideological aspiration or an ideological belief that their self will go somewhere else, will be a non-bodied self, and they will be able to transcend death. Even if that's the case, the self is still transmuting in some way, which means it is no longer of this world, which means the assumptions that we're making about the self in this world are at best transient. And so what is it that we're doing when we're protecting a self that we know is fleeting, we know is going to transform or just completely die? What are we doing in those moments? And if we notice the defense that we're feeling in those moments, what are we actually protecting? My sense with toxic masculinity is what we're protecting against is vulnerability. And in that experience of being vulnerable and the lack of familiarity we as men have with being vulnerable, we seek to project onto others a way of distracting and avoiding what is really fundamental to what is referred to as the self matrix. And what that means is the option of vulnerability is something that we have to hide, or some would say exile. And what that means is this exiled self, this exiled vulnerability is something that we need to conceal and protect, and at all costs create an identity that does not allow anybody to get near that, including ourselves. So we start to know that we're getting near our vulnerability when we get into states of panic, extreme anxiety, and stress, and so on. And what's happening in that process is we are starting to take on this wave of vulnerability that is shattering this sense of self. So the question is, what relationship can we have to our vulnerability? And to me, this is the key in conversations about toxic masculinity. The conversations tend to move towards projecting onto others, and they tend to become political to whatever extent and whatever way. I don't find them to be particularly coherent, but I think that's precisely the point. I think they're the point is, they call it disorganized attachment. The point is to create a kind of sense of chaos around this topic, because that ends up muddying the waters and in and of itself becomes a defense. But if we can cut through all of the distractions, all of the ways in which we politicize and polarize questions of masculinity and toxic masculinity, and we say, is this form of masculinity being used as a way to protect against vulnerability? And I think that's where, going back to the ChatGPT definition, toxic masculinity perpetuates the idea that men must conform to rigid gender roles. I want to emphasize conform here because I think there's a real paradox, which is In trying to be free, we are conforming to rigidity, which means we are unfree. And in doing that, we are actually giving up our freedom. We are giving up our ability to think and to feel more deeply and more richly, and to broaden our experience, instead favoring a more entrapped way of existing that is rigid. We are fighting for the right to be trapped. That's the paradox of toxic masculinity. We are fighting for the political view of being contained within an ideology that does not permit and does not allow, and certainly does not enable us to experience ourselves in ways that are unknown, because in being unknown, we experience vulnerability. And because vulnerability is not modeled as a behavior within, generally speaking, within the masculine self matrix, it is deemed as other, as problematic, as dangerous, as unsafe. So if we, and kind of speaking to this idea of masculinity, if we want to see masculinity through the lens of freedom, through the lens of shifting away from this paradox of control, where in order to be a man, we have to be rigid, which means we have to be unfree, then we need to, by definition, ask, what is my gender? What is my understanding of gender? What is my understanding of this experience of gender beyond any rigid framework? This, of course, can be applied to questions of gender more broadly and within across a spectrum. I won't get into that today, other than to say, if we are looking for the freedom of expression, and if this is going to shift and move and transform in a way that we are following our intuition and hence not captured within a rigid system, then it follows that gender in whatever forms needs to be fluid. And that, of course, includes masculinity. Now, what a person does or doesn't do, that then comes down to a question of choice, which is precisely why it's an existential question. What does a person, in this case a man, actually choose when he picks up the stereotype, the cliche, the proverbial hammer to define his masculinity? And drawing upon the phrase toxic masculinity, what is the function of toxic masculinity? Now, I can't help but think about, and this might sound like a strange analogy, but I can't help but think about alcohol. Now, what's interesting about alcohol is it's a poison, and our drunkenness is our body trying to stop us from drinking. Now, to a certain degree, we take pleasure in that drunkenness, but we are actually poisoning our body. It's a toxic substance in the sense that our body is having a reaction, a visceral reaction to it. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a criticism so much as just an observation about what's actually happening. Similarly here with toxic masculinity, we can say that there's a form of toxicity that's increased within this it's like you could say a kind of drunkenness on masculinity that doesn't allow us to experience masculinity as a part of the spectrum, but it instead narrows our experience down to a very rigid, a very small part of a broader potential. So if we explore this idea of the spectrum, and if we explore this idea of putting toxins into our body, and if we explore this idea of the cliches and the proverbial hammer, and if we put this all under the umbrella of rigidity, and then we say, I do this, I have this rigid system for some reason, and that is to protect against vulnerability, the question starts to become, at least in my mind, this seems like an awful lot of work, probably more work than it's worth, to keep us from sharing and expressing our vulnerability. So why are we going through all of this work to not tell people that we're afraid, to not tell people that we think something is bullshit, to not tell people that we don't want to be defined in that way? What is it that makes all of this other stuff seem better than the alternative of being our own authentic self. And this is where it comes back to the question of culture and society. To what extent are we free to express our identity? If we can only express our identity within the confines of a system, we are therefore not free. If we can only express our likes and dislikes within the likes and dislikes that are presented as options, we are not free. We're picking things. We may have the illusion of freedom, but it's not actually coming from us. So my sense is when we're getting into toxic masculinity, and particularly when we start to talk in these toxic masculinity ways, really what we're doing is we're trying to muddy the waters and avoid choice. And this is why, again, it becomes this fundamentally existential question. Why do we fear choice? And at its core, we fear choice because it presents us with a form of responsibility that is incumbent upon us as individuals, which means we have to be strong enough, we have to have the character, we have to have the insight, we have to have the openness, we have to have the love, we have to have the curiosity, and we have to have, at the end of the day, a kind of leap of faith in the Kierkegaardian sense of stepping into the unknown. And I think this is why the toxic masculinity thing often seems to me like a kind of hazing, like it in and of itself is a kind of defense. And my question is can we move beyond that defense? I mean, what does it actually mean to be a man? What makes me a man? Is it being rigid? Well, if being a man means being rigid, then I can't challenge that idea of rigidity, because I would, in that process, lose being a man. If gender is on a spectrum, that's another way of challenging rigidity. Similar when we get into rights for different people, different genders, different gender experiences, that seemingly challenges our organized world. But fundamentally, what it's doing is it's asking us to understand something beyond the way in which we understand ourselves, which is why it goes back to how do we understand ourselves and our genders based within culture and society. And are we dependent? Are we servants? Are we entrapped within that idea? And as a result, we cannot actually free ourselves, because to do so would be to contradict our own existence. And we fear this loss of self, even though we recognize that there is going to be some form of transformation, there is going to be some form of change, we will die, and so on. And so we do know this change is coming. So why are we resisting that which we know is coming? Is it that we think we can hold on and maintain a sense of control? Is it that this control gives us a sense of power, a sense of prowess, a sense of strength, a sense of certainty? Or is it allows us to avoid or enables us to avoid vulnerability? And then what is it that why is vulnerability so dangerous? My sense is one of the key reasons we dehumanize people, which means we can't permit people to feel vulnerable and empathic towards another, is because we have a system in place that involves exploitation. And exploiting people, in order to exploit someone, you need to dehumanize them in whatever way. And so, built within our system of existence, there becomes a model of exploitation that requires some form of dehumanizing, which then means being vulnerable, hence being empathetic, can't be a part of our kind of self-matrix. Yet, to be human, our fundamental needs, on a very fundamental level, is connection. And so if we are not, or if we are inhibited or not allowed in whatever way to connect, and that becomes a part of the way we organize society, then that creates a limit on what we can experience with one another. And if we can't share our vulnerabilities, or if we can only do it within very restricted ways, people of a certain class, of a certain age, of a certain whatever it is, race, gender, and so on, if we can only do it within those constructed frames, then really what we've got is a way of understanding ourselves that is imposed on us. So, if we go back to this definition about toxic masculinity, for example, toxic masculinity can contribute to the normalization of violence as a way to solve problems, resulting in higher rates of aggression and conflict. But let's just think about this. Toxic masculinity can contribute to the normalization. Let me change violence to normalization of the dehumanization of our relationships, which is to say, if we can experience our vulnerability within ourselves, and yes, in the real world, it may be the case. This doesn't mean you can just walk up to everybody and talk about your vulnerability. But if we don't find ways to connect, to express our vulnerability, like in certain groups getting together and having conversations, and this is something that I've been focusing on as groups for men to talk about precisely these things, because once the space is there to have these kinds of conversations, we are able to unpack these things in a way that opens the door to a kind of experiencing of self that goes beyond the rigid system that is imposed, that is fundamentally dehumanizing, and move into a part of ourselves that is there. It's just a question of it's not fitting within the dehumanized or exploitation-oriented environments where we need to be tough, we need to survive. And just to put this into a little bit of, today kind of context, if a person's living in Toronto and they're dealing with housing instability, food costs are rising, transportation in the city and the roads is a complete mess, people who are artists, that's a real mess. Things are up and down, there's strikes, there's things are in all sorts of stuff is up in the air. But that's also the case for lots of people in lots of different lines of work. So everything is everywhere all at once, to paraphrase the title of this film. And so because everything is everywhere, all happening at once, there is this experience that we need to protect ourselves. And that's where we get back to this question of vulnerability. So to close it off, can we find ways to experience our vulnerability? I'd like to think we can. I'd like to think that there's small ways, big ways, medium-sized ways that we can connect. I'd like to think there's a way to understand our experience that goes beyond these rigid constructs, these toxic constructs, these toxic masculine constructs. And I'd like to think that these conversations that we have with one another can start to question the way in which we understand ourselves, and instead start to rely more upon how we feel about one another and how we feel within ourselves. So this is a topic I'm sure I'll return to at different times, but just to leave you with this one idea, by exploring a definition of something and having a conversation with people, it can create a singular framework. And by being open and vulnerable, we can start to share more of our experience. This wasn't about people convincing one another of arguments that were good or bad. This wasn't a philosophical debate. Rather, this is a way to create a safe space to explore the experience of what it is to be a human. So thanks a lot. Until next time, bye for now.